Silas awoke to the persistent, low-frequency vibration of the abbey's morning bell, not the sharp, alarming toll of a warning, but the deep, resonant hum-thrum that signaled the world's return to order. He lay still beneath the heavy wool quilt, his eyes tracing the joints of the whitewashed stone walls. The air in the guest cell was tempered and still, a stark contrast to the wild, hunting winds of the high ridge that usually acted as his alarm. He felt a profound sense of physical restoration. The ache in his palms had subsided to a dull, satisfied warmth, and his breath did not bloom in a frost cloud as it did in his own workshop. He rose with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, his bare feet meeting the slate floor with a bracing shock that grounded him to the foundation of the abbey. He performed the ritual of the wash at the stone basin, the water clear and cold, shocking the last remnants of sleep from his spirit. He dressed in his heavy mountain wools, the fabric still smelling faintly of cherry shavings and the cedar smoke of the ridge. He navigated the arched corridors, his boots making a soft, rhythmic thud hush on the flagstones, until he reached the great library. There, bathed in the pale, blue-gold light of the valley morning, sat the cherry vessel he had delivered. It looked immovable on its shelf, a captured moment of mountain silence resting in the heart of the stone sanctuary. Father Abbot Michael was already there, standing near the great lectern Silas had restored the day before. He gestured for Silas to follow him once more, leading him back down the winding stairs to the heavy, iron-banded door of the timber crypt. The key turned with that familiar, heavy clunk thud, and the scent of ancient, seasoned wood rushed out to greet them. The abbot led him past the stacks of walnut and oak to a small, velvet-shrouded niche in the very back of the vault. He pulled the fabric away to reveal a single, thick slab of ancient yew. It was wood that defied the eye, dense as iron, colored like a bruised sunset with streaks of deep violet and burnt orange. This was harvested from the great grove before the first stone of the abbey was ever laid. The abbot whispered, his voice a dry rustle in the cool air. It has been waiting 300 years for a hand that understands the fit. Take it back to the ridge, Master Silas. It is to be a crozier for the next generation, a staff that holds the weight of the years to come. Silas reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as they touched the yew. The wood felt electric, vibrating with a stored energy that seemed to push back against his skin. It was the most difficult, most beautiful material he had ever encountered. He accepted the gift with a silent bow, the weight of the slab against his chest feeling like a heavy, holy responsibility. He returned to the surface and began the ritual of the packing of the ascent. He retrieved his mountain sled from the porter's lodge, a stout construction of ash and iron that had carried him through 1,000 drifts. He wrapped the yew slab in several layers of carded wool, then encased it in a protective skin of oiled leather to shield it from the salt mist and the coming snow. He used a series of complex, rhythmic knots to secure the cargo to the sled, his fingers moving with a precision that matched his carving. Each loop of the hemp rope was a promise of security. Each pull of the knot was a meditation on the journey ahead. Silas checked his supplies, dried meat, hard cheese, and a small flask of the abbey's medicinal cider. He stepped out through the great eastern gate, the heavy oak doors groaning as they closed behind him, sealing him back into the world of the elements. The climb back to the high ridge was a journey of focused resistance. As he moved higher, the valley's rose-gold light faded into the sharp, monochromatic white of the altitudes. The air grew thinner, colder, and more honest. Silas leaned into the weight of the sled, his boots making a deep, rhythmic crunch hush in the fresh powder. He thought of the roots of the ancient yew, how they had once gripped the valley's soil for 1,000 years before the tree surrendered its timber to the crypt. To be rooted was to carry the history of the ground within you, even as you climbed toward the sky. He reached the halfway point as the sun began to dip behind the granite peaks, casting long, indigo shadows across the pass. The midway hut appeared like a small, gray ghost in the snow. Silas entered, built a small fire of pine kindling, and sat on the rough bench, his back against the stone. The yew slab sat beside him, a dark presence in the flickering light. He felt the heavy, grounded fatigue of the ascent wash over him, a deep satisfaction that mirrored the stillness of the peaks. He pulled his cloak tight, watched the last blue flame lick around the timber. and closed his eyes. The awakening in the midway hut was a gradual reclamation of the senses, a slow tide of consciousness that rose with the fading of the indigo shadows in the stone corners. Silas did not move for several minutes, allowing his body to acknowledge the deep, heavy cold that had settled into his cloak despite the residual heat of the banked fire. The air in the hut was thin and tasted of old granite and the sharp, metallic tang of the coming storm. He felt the absolute stillness of the high pass, a silence so dense it seemed to press against his eardrums with a rhythmic, hollow thrum. He reached out his hand, his fingers finding the rough, oiled leather of the transport bundle, and he felt the immediate, low-frequency vibration of the ancient yew within. It was as if the wood were a living heart, waiting for the return of the mountain light. Silas rose with a slow, grinding effort, his joints singing a quiet song of resistance that mirrored the creak of the mountain itself. He did not rush the morning. He performed the ritual of the internal fire, drinking a small measure of the abbey's medicinal cider and eating a piece of the hard, salt-cured cheese. The warmth traveled to him like a slow fuse, igniting his resolve for the final, most treacherous leg of the ascent. He shouldered the sled straps, feeling the weight of the yew slab settle against his spine like a heavy, holy promise. Stepping out of the hut, he was met by the crest wind, a razor-sharp gale that didn't just blow, but seemed to scour the landscape, lifting the fine, crystalline powder into swirling ghosts of white. The light was a flat, uncompromising silver that erased the distance, leaving Silas in a world defined only by the next 10 feet of the trail. He began the step of the summit, a rhythmic, focused crawl through the drifts where his breath became a visible, percussive counting of the seconds. Crunch hush. Crunch hush. The sound of his boots in the fresh snow was the only anchor in the whiteout. He thought of the roots of the pines that lay buried beneath him, how they gripped the frozen stone with a strength that defied the gales, and he drew that same anchored energy into his own legs. As he crossed the spine of the sky, the narrowest point of the ridge, the wind reached a high, melodic shriek that vibrated through the metal runners of the sled. Silas leaned into the pressure, his world narrowed down to the sensation of the hemp rope biting into his shoulders and the persistent, electric hum of the yew at his back. He felt a profound sense of isolation, yet it was an isolation that brought a piercing clarity. Here, on the threshold of the heights, the valley was a distant dream and the workshop was the only reality that remained. He saw the first dark outcropping of the Granite Sentinel, the rock formation that guarded the lee of his workshop, and he felt a surge of grounded relief. The final 100 yards were a battle of pure endurance, his muscles burning with a pleasant, honest fire that countered the freezing spray. He reached his own door, which was nearly buried beneath a 3-foot drift of powder. He retrieved a small, iron-shod spade from the sled and began the ritual of the opening. Shovel scrape. Shovel thud. The sound was a familiar percussive greeting, a declaration of his return to his kingdom. He cleared the threshold, the eyes snapping away from the frame with a sound like a small rifle shot. He pushed the heavy cedar door open, the hinges offering a deep, resonant groan of welcome that vibrated in the floorboards. Inside, the workshop was a sanctuary of frozen fragrance. The scent of cherry, cedar, and bog oak dust had been captured by the cold, waiting for the return of the heat. Silas entered, pulling the sled and its precious cargo behind him, and closed the door against the hunting wind. The click of the iron latch was a sound of absolute safety. He moved immediately to the cast iron stove, his movements now energized by the familiarity of the space. He cleared the white ash and built a foundation fire of resinous pine knots and heavy oak splits. He watched the first orange tongues of flame lit the mica windows, the light beginning to dance across the tool racks and the workbenches. As the temperature began to rise, chasing the frost ferns from the corners of the ceiling, Silas turned his attention to the sled. He began the unmasking of the gift, his fingers moving with a painstaking slowness over the complex knots he had tied in the valley. He released the leather skin, then the layers of lanolin heavy wool, until the ancient yew slab lay exposed on the maple workbench. In the flickering firelight of his own shop, the wood looked different, more dangerous, more beautiful. The violet and orange streaks in the grain seemed to pulse with the incoming heat, the fibers expanding with a microscopic, percussive sound that only a carver's ear could detect. Silas stood before the workbench, his hands resting on the cool, dense surface of the timber, feeling the immense weight of the 300 years it had spent waiting for this moment. He was home. The ridge was roaring outside, the stove was humming within, and the yew was ready for the first cut. He felt the heavy, grounded fatigue of the climb begin to transition into the maker's vigil, a state of alert, rhythmic readiness that preceded the birth of a masterpiece. He took a slow, deep breath of the warming air, his mind already tracing the first line of the crozier. Silas stood before the maple workbench, his hands hovering inches above the ancient yew slab, feeling the radiant heat of the workshop meet the deep, stored cold of the timber. The maker's vigil had taken hold of him, a state of narrow, intense clarity where the howling mountain gales outside were reduced to a distant, irrelevant hum. The yew was a formidable opponent. It was wood that had survived centuries of valley storms and 300 years of stonebound seasoning in the abbey's crypt. In the flickering orange light of the stove, the streaks of violet and burnt orange in the grain seemed to swirl with a hidden, liquid energy, looking less like a botanical structure and more like a celestial map. Silas reached for his layout kit, a small cedar box containing his most precise measuring tools, a brass-bound marking gauge, a compass forged from high-carbon steel, and a single piece of white soapstone. He began the ritual of the lineage trace, the process of finding the crozier's path within the raw slab. He moved the soapstone with a glacial slowness, his eyes tracing the flow of the fibers, looking for the strongest route that would allow the finished staff to bear the weight of a generation. To be rooted was to understand that the wood dictates the form, never the other way around. He found a great curve, near the top of the slab, a place where the yew had naturally bent toward the valley sun, and he marked the sweep of the handle with a single, unswerving line. The sound of the soapstone against the dense yew was a dry, percussive whisper, a soft shhh tuck that signaled the first contract between the maker and the material. As he completed the layout, marking the taper of the shaft and the flare of the base, Silas felt the immense responsibility of the task. He was not just carving a tool, but an anchor for the spirit. He reached for his primary shaping tool, a heavy, two-handed draw knife with handles of scorched oak. He checked the edge one last time, the steel gleaming with it. Scary sharp, luster that promised no mercy to the resistance of the grain. He positioned himself at the end of the bench, his feet braced against the cedar floorboards, his breath a slow, rhythmic tide. He made the first incision. Grind slice. Grind slice. The sound was guttural and honest, a deep vibration that traveled through the handles, into his forearms, and settled in his shoulders. The yew did not surrender easily. It was dense as iron and twice as stubborn. A long, thick shaving of orange-violet wood curled away from the blade, falling to the floor with a heavy, wooden clack. The scent that erupted from the cut was unlike anything Silas had encountered on the ridge. It was spicy, metallic, and carried the peaty depth of the ancient grove. He worked with a meticulous, heavy pressure, removing the rough exterior to reveal the vibrant, electric heart of the timber. Every stroke was a meditation on the step of the ascent, a focused effort that required him to lean into the wood with his entire being. The pile of yew shavings began to gather at his feet, looking like a mound of sunset-colored ribbons in the dim light. Silas paused frequently to wipe the blade with a piece of silk, checking the progress of the line against the soapstone marks. He was looking for the resonance point, the moment where the wood's internal tension would balance with the external form he was imposing upon it. He moved his focus to the handle curve, using a smaller, curved spoke shape to refine the sweep. Hush-hush-hush-hush. Hush-hush-hush-hush. The sound moved from a grind to a whisper as the wood became smoother and more compliant. The afternoon shifted into the deep, indigo hours of the evening, the frost ferns on the window panes growing thicker as the temperature outside plummeted. Inside, the workshop was a sanctuary of heat and purpose, the only movement the slow, rhythmic dance of Silas's arms as he chased the crozier out of the yew. He felt the heavy, grounded fatigue of the last few days finally beginning to merge with the satisfaction of the work. The staff was emerging, a powerful, glowing shape that felt balanced and alive in his hands. He made one final, sweeping pass along the length of the shaft, the blade moving with a silken, effortless glide that signaled the end of the primary shaping. Silas stood back, his chest heaving slightly, his palms warm and stained with the spicy oils of yew. He looked at the staff resting in the vise, a dark, violet-streaked sentinel that was now ready for the refinement of the gouge and the polish of the stone. The ridge was roaring with a new storm, the stove was clicking as it cooled, and the first stage of the covenant was complete. Silas felt the immense weight of the journey finally descend upon him, a restful, holy exhaustion that demanded a surrender to the night. He banked the fire with a thick layer of gray ash, preserving the embers for the morning watch. He walked to the small cot, the floorboards offering a final, familiar creak of greeting. He pulled the heavy cloak to his chin, the scent of the yew still clinging to his skin like a fragrant promise. The mountain was at rest, the wood was at peace, and the spirit was settled. Silas sat on the edge of the cot, his hands resting on his knees, feeling the rhythmic heat of the stove pulse against the cedar walls of the workshop. The maker's vigil had not truly released him. It had simply shifted from the physical exertion of the draw knife to the internal mapping of the next stage. The ancient yew staff sat in the vise, a dark, violet-streaked shadow that seemed to hold the cold of the mountain pass within its core, refusing to yield entirely to the warmth of the room. Outside, the storm had entered its granite phase, a high-frequency shriek of wind that carried the abrasive grit of frozen snow, scouring the workshop's stone foundations. Silas rose, his movement a slow, deliberate reclamation of purpose, and walked to the window. He could see nothing but the swirling ghosts of the ridge, the world erased by the whiteout, leaving his sanctuary as the only point of reality in the void. He moved to the small cabinet beneath the rafters and retrieved a length of undyed silk, which he dampened with a few drops of lavender water. He tied the cloth around his face, covering his nose and mouth. Yew was a wood of ancient power, but its dust was a silent poison, a spicy, resinous grit that could cloud the lungs if not respected. This was the sacrifice of the mask, a ritual of protection that signaled the transition to the fine carving. He returned to the workbench and selected a small, deep-sweep gouge, its handle turned from the same hornbeam as his mallet. He checked the edge under the light of the oil lamp, seeing a line of silver so thin it was almost invisible, the mark of a blade that could sever a thought. He began the spiraling trace, a technique that required him to carve a continuous, rising line around the shaft of the crozier, mimicking the way the yew had grown toward the sun in the abbey's grove. Scree-hush. Scree-hush. The sound was a high, melodic note that vibrated through the steel and into the bones of his hands. Every pass of the gouge removed a ribbon of wood that was orange on one side and deep purple on the other, a binary history of the tree's life. He spent hours on this single spiral, his body leaning into the curve, his weight shifting from his heels to the balls of his feet in a slow, percussive dance. He felt the minute variations in the wood's density. Here, a century of slow growth where the rings were packed tight as parchment. There, a decade of abundance where the fibers were wider and more resilient. The steel encountered a small, petrified knot, a place where a branch had been suppressed for 50 years. Silas adjusted his pressure, his fingers detecting the change in resistance before the wood could splinter. He worked around the obstruction with a rhythmic, circular motion, the gouge singing a different, lower frequency as it navigated the density. He thought of the tools themselves, how the steel had been forged in the valley. Fires and tempered in the mountain snows, a union of elements that now allowed him to commune with the yew. He spent a full 3 hours just on the base of the shaft, ensuring that the spiral transition was as smooth as a natural growth. Silas focused on the weight of the hand, ensuring that the depth of the cut remained consistent as he moved from the flared base toward the handle curve. He thought of the roots of the yew, how they had survived 3 centuries of valley history, drinking the same rains that had once fed the ancestors of the monks. To be rooted was to be a repository of time. He moved his focus to the head of the staff, the great curve he had laid out with the soapstone. Here, the grain was a chaotic, beautiful whirlpool of knots and swirls, He switched to a tiny, needle-pointed V-tool, a chisel designed for the most intricate detail. He began to carve the map of the ridge into the handle, a series of microscopic lines that mirrored the topography of the high ridge itself. He carved the Granite Sentinel, the standing stones, and the path that led to the abbey. He worked with a magnifying glass held in his left hand, his right hand moving with the precision of a surgeon. He carved the very fissures in the rock, the secret springs that only he knew, and the exact slant of his own workshop roof. Click-tock, click-tock. The sound of the small bone mallet was a percussive counting of the seconds, a heartbeat for the silence. He spent an entire watch just on the depiction of the standing stones, ensuring that the shadows carved into the wood matched the shadows cast by the mountain sun at noon. He spent hours refining the valley pass, a section where the wood was particularly dense and required a series of thousands of microscopic, overlapping cuts. The yew resisted his steel with an ancient, stubborn pride, but Silas did not force the metal. He waited for the wood to invite the cut. He felt the spicy, peaty dust settle on his forearms, a fine powder that looked like ground amethyst in the lamplight. He spent hours in this state of microfocus, his eyes inches from the yew, his breath a slow, filtered tide through the silk. The scent of the yew dust was now a physical presence in the room, sharp, peaty, and metallic. He felt a deep sense of companionship with the material. The yew was no longer resisting, it was participating, surrendering its secrets to the steel with a quiet, honest dignity. As the night deepened, the lantern oil began to run low, the flame flickering and casting long, wavering shadows that made the carvings on the handle look as though they were moving. Silas paused to refill the reservoir, the liquid oil a golden swirl in the amber light. He took a single sip of the abbey cider, feeling the tart warmth settle his spirit. He returned to the bench for the ritual of the 7 stones. He retrieved a set of polished river stones, each a different grade of abrasive density, ranging from coarse granite to fine, translucent jade. He began the dry sanding, his hand moving in long, rhythmic sweeps along the length of the staff. He started with the first stone, a gray granite with a tooth like a winter gale. Scrape hush. Scrape hush. This stone removed the microscopic ridges left by the gouge, leveling the landscape of the staff. He worked this stone for a full hour, his arm moving in a steady, unbroken arc from base to head, his eyes closed as he relied entirely on the percussive vibration in his palm to tell him when the surface was true. Every 20 minutes, he would stop to wipe the gray dust away with a piece of rabbit felt, checking the honesty of the plane against the light. Then came the second stone, a brown sandstone that smelled of the riverbank. This stone began to close the pores of the yew, turning the rough surface into a tackle map of endurance. He spent another hour on the shaft alone, his movements synchronized with the rhythmic humdrum of the stove. The sound of the sandstone was a softer, more gravelly whisper, a percussive song of transition. The third stone was a red siltstone, which brought out the first hints of the grain's inner fire, the violet streaks beginning to glow against the orange heartwood. Silas spent 90 minutes on the handle curve with his stone, ensuring the transitions between the topographical carvings were as smooth as the rock they represented. He felt the heat rising in the wood, a friction-borne energy that seemed to wake the resins. The fourth stone was a dark slate, which Silas used to refine the micro-carvings on the handle, the stone fitting into the grooves he had cut with the V-tool. Wish-sh-h-h-h. Wish-sh-h-h-h. The sound was becoming smoother, more liquid, a percussive whisper that seemed to echo the sound of the rain against the cedar shingles. He worked the slate for 2 hours, his fingers cramping slightly but his mind remaining clear and anchored. The fifth stone was a pale quartz, which generated a slight friction heat, drawing the natural oils of the yew to the surface. He felt the wood become slick and responsive, a living thing beneath his palm. He worked the quartz in tight, circular motions for 2 hours, watching as the wood began to develop a deep, internal shimmer. The scent changed here, moving from peaty to a sweet, resinous perfume that signaled the wood's surrender. The sixth stone was a piece of obsidian, black and glass-like, which compressed the fibers until the yew began to reflect the light of the stove. This was the work of the deep mirror, where the wood surrendered its texture to the light. He spent another 3 hours on this stage, his arm moving with the regularity of a pendulum, his breathing a deep, rhythmic support for the motion. Finally, he reached for the seventh stone, a piece of translucent green jade. This was the stone of the final breath. He worked the jade with a glacial slowness, the friction generating a microscopic heat that fused the natural resins of the yew into a permanent, iridescent shield. He spent 4 hours on this final stage, his breath a slow, rhythmic tide that never wavered, his world reduced to the 4 inches of wood directly beneath the jade. The staff was no longer a piece of timber. It was a captured frequency of the mountain's endurance. Silas stood back, his chest heaving slightly behind the silk mask, his palms warm and stained with the ancient essence of the grove. He spent another 3 hours on the final burnishing of the handle mat, ensuring that every peak and valley was as smooth as a river-worn pebble. He felt the immense weight of the 300 years of seasoning finally balancing with the weight of his own 40 years on the ridge. The crozier was finished, a powerful, flowing shape that felt balanced, alive, and ready to hold the weight of the years to come. He removed the silk mask, the cold air of the workshop hitting his face with a bracing clarity. He walked to the window one last time. The storm had finally broken, leaving a world of absolute, star-strewn blackness. The Milky Way was a luminous ribbon across the peaks, a celestial mirror of the grain lines he had just polished. But before the final rest, Silas felt the necessity of the anchor ritual. He lifted the finished staff and stepped to the cedar door. He pushed it open, the cold mountain air rushing in like a solid wall of ice. He stepped out onto the Granite Sentinel outcropping, the staff in his right hand. He raised the yew toward the stars, allowing the sub-zero wind to case-harden the beeswax and oil finish. He felt the vibration of the mountain travel up through the stone, into his boots, and meet the vibration of the yew in his palm. They were now one, the mountain, the maker, and the wood. He stood there for a full hour in the silence of the high ridge, a sentinel of the snows, watching as the first microscopic thinning of the darkness began in the east. He felt the profound resonance of the covenant, the realization that his labor had successfully bridged the gap between the valley's history and the ridge's endurance. He returned to the workshop, the heat of the stove now a welcoming, domestic grace. He placed the staff in its rack, the wood glowing in the dying lamplight like a captured ember. He moved toward the stove, the oak log now a bed of glowing, white-hot embers. He stirred them once, the orange light illuminating the fine violet dust that had gathered on his sleeves. He banked the fire with a thick, insulating layer of ash, ensuring the warmth would remain for the dawn. He walked to the small cot, the floorboards offering a final, familiar creak of greeting, a sound of arrival and rest. Silas sat on the bed, looking at the glowing staff in the vise, feeling the immense, grounded peace of a task perfectly completed. He spent a long time simply breathing in the scent of the finished work, the spicy aroma of the yew mixing with the sweet resin of the pine fire. He pulled the heavy down quilt over his shoulders, the warmth wrapping around him like the silence of the pines. The ridge was stilled, the work was done, the spirit was steady, and the mountain was at peace. Silas closed his eyes, his breath slowing to match the rhythm of the deep earth, and in that absolute quietude he slept.